The sky over occupied France was a pane of flawless blue crystal. 27,000 feet below, the world was a miniature map of green fields and gray villages. For the German pilot cocooned in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, this was his domain. He was a knight of the upper air, a master of a deadly craft honed over 4 years of relentless war. And from his perch, he watched in utter disbelief as a lone American fighter, crippled and trailing smoke, refused to die. The German ace had done everything right. He had dived from the sun, his cannons spitting fury. He had watched his 20mm shells tear into the American aircraft, each impact a bright, satisfying flash of orange against the olive-drab fuselage. The enemy's canopy had shattered. Fire had bloomed behind its instrument panel. By every law of aerial combat, the American plane should have been a spiraling torch, a plume of black smoke marking another victory for the Reich. But it wasn't. Battered, riddled with holes, and flying with the grace of a falling brick, the American machine, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, limped stubbornly onward toward the English Channel. The German pilot, his cannon ammunition exhausted, pulled alongside the wreck. He stared, dumbfounded, at the chaos in the opposing cockpit. He could see the American pilot, a man trapped in a cage of shattered plexiglass and burning wires. He saw the gaping wounds in the fuselage, the control surfaces shredded to ribbons, the massive radial engine still somehow pulling the 10-ton monster through the sky. He closed in again, emptying his machine guns into the dying beast. Still, it flew. In a moment that would transcend the brutal logic of war, the German pilot pulled alongside one last time. He looked at his adversary, shook his head in a gesture of pure, unadulterated disbelief, rendered a strange, informal salute, and peeled away, his ammunition spent and his certainty shattered. The man in the crippled Thunderbolt, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, would somehow wrestle his flying sieve back to England, where ground crews would stop counting the bullet holes after 200. But the real impact of that single, desperate flight wasn't measured in holes. It was measured in the seismic shockwave it sent through the German Luftwaffe. It was the first tremor of a terrifying revelation. This story is not merely about a tough airplane. It's about a profound, catastrophic failure of imagination. It's the story of how the German Luftwaffe, the most professional and battle-hardened air force in the world, laughed at the very weapon that was destined to annihilate it. They saw a fat, clumsy flying milk bottle, and in their arrogance they failed to recognize a revolution. They judged the P-47 by the old rules of air combat, rules of elegant turns and graceful climbs. They failed to understand that America hadn't just built a new fighter. It had built a new kind of war, a war of overwhelming power, of industrial brutality, and of sheer, stubborn, indestructible mass. This is the story of how that laughter, echoing in the thin air of 1943, turned into a silent scream that would haunt the skies over the fallen Reich. The central thesis is this: the P-47 Thunderbolt's victory was not in spite of its perceived flaws, but because of them. Its immense weight, its ruggedness, and its colossal engine were not design compromises. They were the core components of a new doctrine of aerial warfare, a doctrine the Luftwaffe was utterly unprepared to face. To understand the German laughter, we must first rewind to a world that existed before the Thunderbolt's shadow fell across Europe. April 8, 1943. High above the French countryside, Oberleutnant Ralph Arthur Hermeken, a veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26, adjusted his oxygen mask and smirked. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190 A5, He watched a formation of ungainly silhouettes laboriously clawing their way toward him. They were the new American fighters, making their combat debut. Die Amis haben uns fliegende Milchflaschen geschickt, he transmitted to his wingman. The Yanks have sent us flying milk bottles. The laughter that followed was genuine, born of confidence and contempt. To German eyes, conditioned by years of fighting sleek British Spitfires and nimble Soviet Yaks, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts were an aesthetic offense. Their barrel-shaped fuselages, topped with greenhouse-like canopies, seemed almost comically corpulent. Their wings looked too small for their massive bodies, and their propellers dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. This contempt was rooted in a deeply ingrained and battle-proven philosophy of fighter design. For the Germans, the ideal fighter was an extension of the pilot's will. A lightweight, agile rapier optimized for climb and turn performance. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the embodiment of this idea. A small airframe wrapped around the most powerful liquid-cooled engine available. Its successor in many units, the Focke-Wulf 190, was seen as the pinnacle of this evolution. A brutal, powerful interceptor that combined speed, climb rate, and a heavy cannon armament into a perfectly balanced package. Air combat, as the Luftwaffe understood it, was a deadly ballet, a three-dimensional chess match where the most agile piece would invariably checkmate the king. Into this world of finely tuned fencing foils, the Americans had just thrown a sledgehammer. The P-47's origin story begins in the panic of June 1940. As German panzers stormed across France and the Luftwaffe swept the skies clean, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued an urgent demand for a high-altitude interceptor capable of meeting the German threat. The task fell to Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant Georgian-born engineer. Kartveli looked at the requirements, looked at the available technology, and made a decision that would defy every convention of fighter design. The heart of his new aircraft would be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, a monster that produced an unprecedented 2,000 horsepower. But raw power wasn't enough. To operate at high altitude, it needed a turbo supercharger, a complex device that used the engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine, compressing the thin stratospheric air to maintain sea-level engine performance. The problem was its size. The turbo unit and its labyrinth of intercoolers and ducting were enormous. A conventional design would have resulted in a bloated, drag-filled nightmare. Kartveli's solution was both insane and ingenious. Instead of trying to cram the system around the engine, he designed the entire aircraft around the turbocharger system. The ducting ran from the engine back through the cavernous belly of the fuselage to the turbo unit near the tail, and then forward again to the engine. This decision dictated the P-47's iconic, deep-bellied shape. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli candidly admitted to his design team. "But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." When the XP-47B prototype first flew on May 6, 1941, it shocked everyone. Weighing nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it was 65% heavier than its predecessor. Test pilots, accustomed to slimmer fighters, would walk up to the behemoth and ask the same incredulous question: "This thing actually flies?" Fly it did, but it was a violent and unforgiving beast to tame. The transition to the Thunderbolt was a brutal education for the fledgling U.S. Army Air Forces. At the 56th Fighter Group, training in Connecticut under the command of the demanding Major Hubert Hub Zemke, the P-47 earned a terrifying nickname, the Widowmaker. Between September 1942 and January 1943, The group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents alone. The Thunderbolt killed more Americans in training than the Germans would in the first bloody months of combat. Its sheer mass and the ferocious torque of its engine made it prone to ground looping on landing and violently rolling on takeoff. Its very strength, its ability to dive, revealed a new and terrifying aerodynamic phenomenon: compressibility. As pilots pushed the plane past 500 miles per hour in a dive, shock waves would form on the wings, freezing the controls solid and turning the fighter into an unguided missile. So when the first P-47s arrived in England, the German prejudice was reinforced by the Americans' own tragic experience. The early combat encounters in April and May of 1943 seemed to confirm every German assumption. The P-47s couldn't turn with the agile Focke-Wulfs. They couldn't climb with the Messerschmitts. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, the swaggering commander of JG-26, filed a now infamous report after his first encounter. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. His pilots mockingly called them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. The initial statistics were grim. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. Pilots of the Royal Air Force, observing from their elegant Spitfires, quietly suggested the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of aircraft. A popular joke in RAF messes was that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. The myth was set in stone. The Thunderbolt was a failure, a testament to American ignorance of modern air combat. It was too big, too heavy, too clumsy. It was a flying milk bottle, just waiting to be shot down. But beneath the surface of these early defeats, a strange and unsettling pattern was emerging. A detail that German intelligence, in its confidence, failed to properly analyze. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed an unbelievable amount of punishment before they fell. One returned to base with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have vaporized a Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking the vulnerable liquid coolant systems of its German and British counterparts, could shrug off hits that would have seized an inline engine in seconds. The Germans were winning the battles, but they were missing the point. They were so focused on the P-47's weaknesses that they hadn't yet been properly introduced to its strengths. And on June 26, 1943, that introduction would arrive in the form of a single, savaged aircraft that simply refused to obey the rules of death. June 26, 1943. The sky over Villacoublay, France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was flying at the tail end of his formation, the unenviable position known as Tail End Charlie. His group of 48 Thunderbolts was heading home after an escort mission when the sky tore open. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the legendary Adolf Galland, executed a perfect bounce, diving out of the sun with a massive speed advantage. For Johnson, the world dissolved into a cacophony of violence. His Thunderbolt was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers. In the first few seconds, it felt as if his aircraft had been hit by a volley of airborne sledgehammers. No fewer than 21 20mm cannon shells found their mark. The canopy exploded inwards, showering him with razor-sharp fragments of plexiglass. Hot, slick hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit, blinding him. The engine cowling was ripped away, and an electrical fire erupted behind the instrument panel, filling the space with acrid smoke. Wounded in his nose and leg by shrapnel, Johnson fought his instincts. His training screamed at him to bail out. The plane was dying. He reached for the canopy release handle to jettison the shattered shell and escape. It wouldn't budge. He pulled again, with all his strength. Nothing. In a cruel twist of fate, a 20mm shell had exploded directly in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped. 27,000 feet up, inside a burning, disintegrating coffin. This should have been the end. But what happened next was the single event, the first critical domino that began to unravel the entire German perception of the Thunderbolt. It was the moment that shattered the myth of the flying milk bottle. With his forward visibility completely obscured by a sheet of oil from the tortured engine, Johnson somehow managed to wrestle the bucking controls, level the aircraft, and point its nose vaguely in the direction of England. The P-47, an aircraft that by all rights should have been a cloud of falling debris, continued to fly. The structural integrity that Alexander Kartveli had designed into its very bones, the over-engineered spars and bulkheads, was holding the machine together through sheer brute force. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, had been shot clean through, and still it flew. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, its pilot likely assuming an easy kill to add to his tally, spotted the crippled giant limping home at less than 170 miles per hour. The German pilot, whose identity remains a mystery to this day, settled in behind Johnson for the coup de grace. He opened fire, stitching the Thunderbolt from tail to nose with his remaining cannons and machine guns. Johnson, unable to maneuver, could do nothing but huddle behind his 3/8-inch steel armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt absorbed the punishment. The German closed in again, this time firing only his machine guns, his cannon ammunition spent. The heavy American fighter shuddered under the impacts, but stubbornly refused to fall. It was at this moment that the cold mechanics of combat gave way to pure human astonishment. The German pilot, perhaps out of ammunition, or perhaps simply overcome by disbelief, pulled up alongside Johnson's flying wreck. Johnson, peering through a clear patch in the side of his shattered canopy, could see his attacker's face clearly. He was young, blonde, and his expression was a cocktail of confusion and something that bordered on awe. He wasn't looking at an enemy. He was looking at an impossibility. The German pilot repositioned himself one last time, perhaps to confirm what his eyes were telling him. He then pulled alongside again, gave Johnson that stunned, informal salute, and banked away, leaving the American to his fate. That fate was survival. Johnson's P-47 made it back across the channel, its engine finally seizing on the runway at RAF Manston. The sight that greeted the ground crew was apocalyptic. The armor plate behind his seat had stopped a cannon shell. Another had exploded inches from his head. The engine had taken direct hits. Control cables were frayed to a few strands. And yet, the dinosaur had brought its pilot home. The survival of Robert Johnson's aircraft was more than just a remarkable war story. It was a piece of hard, undeniable data. For the Americans, studying the mangled wreckage was a revelation. They realized they had underestimated their own creation. Its survivability wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. For the Germans, the combat reports from Gallen's squadron were initially dismissed as hysterical exaggeration. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment and continue to fly. But as multiple pilot testimonies confirmed the story, a chilling realization began to dawn within the Luftwaffe High Command. Their entire assessment of the P-47 was dangerously, perhaps fatally, flawed. The milk bottle had teeth and armor, and a stubborn refusal to die that defied all logic. The laughter was beginning to fade, replaced by a question that had no easy answer. If our best weapons can't kill this thing, what will it take? The first domino had fallen, and it was about to trigger a chain reaction that would change the course of the air war. The survival of Robert Johnson was not an isolated miracle. It was the inciting incident for a forensic re-examination of the P-47 on both sides. This was the autopsy of a myth, and its findings would unleash a devastating ripple effect, a series of falling dominoes that would systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe's dominance. The first to fall was the dogma of agility. American commanders like Hub Zemke, the man who had initially despised the P-47, began to see the light. Through brutal trial and error, they formulated a new set of commandments for their pilots. Don't turn with a Focke-Wulf. Don't try to outclimb a Messerschmitt at low altitude. These were the admissions of weakness. But then came the strengths. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, once its greatest perceived disadvantage, was reforged into its primary weapon. In a dive, the P-47 was untouchable. Its 7-ton mass gave it a phenomenal level of potential energy. From 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could plunge towards the Earth at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could follow, without risking structural failure. This incredible speed could then be converted back into altitude in a zoom climb, leaving any pursuer wallowing helplessly below. Pilots like Captain Walker Bud Mahurin perfected this new science of energy fighting. They called it boom and zoom, or more colloquially, the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. It was less a dogfight and more an execution. P-47 formations would climb to the stratosphere, to 30,000 feet or higher, orbiting like patient vultures. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below to attack the bomber streams, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive. To the German pilots, they appeared as if from nowhere, an avalanche of metal descending at a velocity that made deflection shooting impossible. At the bottom of the dive, the Thunderbolts would speak, and the result was carnage. The true nature of that voice was the second domino to fall. The Germans had completely misjudged the lethality of the P-47's armament. On paper, 850 caliber machine guns seemed less impressive than the 20mm and 30mm cannons favored by the Luftwaffe. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The armament of the P-47 wasn't just a collection of guns. It was a cohesive weapons system. Each plane carried an astonishing 3,400 rounds of ammunition, weighing nearly 900 pounds. This allowed for sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in a fight that was often decided in two. The guns were harmonized to a specific convergence point, typically 300 yards out, where all 8 streams of bullets would intersect in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything entering that zone faced 100 armor-piercing incendiary projectiles per second. German pilots who survived an encounter described it not as gunfire, but as hitting a solid wall of lead. The August 17, 1943, raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg provided a horrifying demonstration. Major David Schilling's squadron encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Bf 110 Zerstorer heavy fighters moving in to attack the B-17s. These twin-engine planes were the Luftwaffe's dedicated bomber killers, heavily armed with cannons and rockets. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts dove on them. An Unteroffizier who survived later recounted from a POW camp, "The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tail severed. In 2 seconds, a Bf-110 became nothing. In that single pass, which lasted less than a minute, 8 German heavy fighters were obliterated. The ammunition itself was a product of America's industrial genius. While German cannon shells often exploded on the surface of an aircraft, American 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds were designed to penetrate, before detonating, their incendiary charge deep inside the enemy's structure, igniting fuel lines and ammunition. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become America's top ace in Europe, put it bluntly. When you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw a 109 literally cut in half. The next domino was the one that gave the P-47 its ultimate advantage: altitude. Kartvel's decision to build the plane around the turbo supercharger now paid its most significant dividend. While German fighters relied on mechanical superchargers that were directly driven by their engines, the P-47's turbo used free energy from the hot exhaust gases. This system was far more efficient at extreme altitudes. Above 25,000 feet, where the air grew thin, German engines began to gasp for oxygen. The performance of the Bf-109 and FW-190 degraded significantly. For the P-47, however, this was its natural environment. The R-2800 Double Wasp could maintain its full 2,000 horsepower rating all the way up to 30,000 feet. The Thunderbolt didn't just fly at high altitude, it thrived there. On October 8, 1943, this reality claimed one of Germany's greatest aces. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords holder with 206 victories, led his squadron against B-17s over Bremen. At 28,000 feet, his Focke-Wulf 190 felt sluggish, its powerful engine starved for air. That's when Robert S. Johnson, now a seasoned combat veteran, dove on his formation from 31,000 feet. Johnson's combat report was brutally clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. The death of Hans Philipp sent a shockwave through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived over 500 missions, could be swatted from the sky with such ease, what chance did anyone else have? The Americans had created a new battlefield in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, a place where the Luftwaffe was no longer king. Even as the existing P-47s were dominating the skies, an even deadlier version was on its way. In January 1944, the P-47 D-22 model began arriving in England. It featured a single, crucial upgrade: a new Hamilton standard propeller with massive, broad paddle blades. This seemingly small change had a dramatic effect. The new prop bit into the air with far greater authority, drastically improving the Thunderbolt's one remaining weakness: its climb rate. The anemic 2,200 feet per minute of earlier models jumped to over 3,000 feet per minute, putting it on par with, or even superior to, its German adversaries. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of JG-11 wrote in his diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced to formation, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blades also changed the plane's sound, creating a deep, thundering roar as the blade tips went supersonic. German troops on the ground began to call it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap, a terrifying guttural rumble that announced death from above. With its performance flaws corrected and its dominance in the air established, the P-47 was ready for its final, most devastating role. As more long-range P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over bomber escort duties, the Thunderbolt was unleashed upon the German army on the ground. Its rugged airframe and powerful engine made it an ideal platform for what the Germans called a jawbow, or fighter bomber. It could carry a staggering 2.5 tons of ordnance, two 1,000-pound bombs and a 500-pounder, a bomb load equal to a light bomber from just a few years earlier. It could also carry 10 5-inch rockets, each with the destructive power of an artillery shell. This, combined with its .850 caliber guns, turned the P-47 into a flying tank destroyer. In the weeks following the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, P-47's systematically annihilated German logistics. They roamed the French countryside at will, hunting anything that moved. Oberst Hans von Luck, a panzer commander in Normandy, described the experience. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, paralyzing its ability to respond to the Allied breakout. The Thunderbolt wasn't just winning the air war anymore. It was strangling the German army on the ground. The final and most decisive domino was not a piece of technology or a tactic. It was the crushing, overwhelming reality of American industrial might. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a last-gasp surprise attack on Allied airfields. At Airfield Y-34, German fighters destroyed 22 P-47's on the ground. A captured German pilot, brought before the base commander, Major George Bostwick, taunted him. "What do you think of that?" Bostwick's reply became a legend. He pointed to the flight line where crews were already pushing replacement aircraft into the empty slots. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones," he said calmly. "How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk vanished. He knew the answer. The Luftwaffe lost 213 irreplaceable pilots that day. The Americans lost aircraft that were replaced within 48 hours, flown in from massive depots in England. Republic Aviation's factories in New York and Indiana were churning out Thunderbolts around the clock. At its peak, the Farmingdale plant completed one P-47 every hour. America didn't just build planes. It built a system. It trained 30,000 pilots a year, each with 4 times the flight hours of their German counterparts by 1945. It produced billions of rounds of ammunition and millions of gallons of high-octane fuel. The German pilots had laughed at a single aircraft in 1943. By 1945, they were being buried under an avalanche of them. Every domino had fallen, and the result was the complete and utter destruction of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1945, the laughter was a distant, hollow memory. The Luftwaffe was a ghost, its once proud wings clipped by a lack of fuel, pilots, and hope. Joseph Priller, the same ace who had mocked the P-47 as a pregnant cow, was interviewed by propaganda officials. His assessment, deemed too demoralizing to publish, was a complete surrender. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. But beyond the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose one, it's gone forever. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. The numbers tell a story of industrial annihilation. P-47s were credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks, and over 120,000 trucks and other vehicles. They achieved a 4.6-to-1 kill ratio in air-to-air combat, all while having the lowest loss rate of any major American fighter. After the war, at a reunion of former adversaries, General Adolf Galland, the wartime head of Germany's fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His words serve as the final epitaph for the Luftwaffe's fatal misjudgment. "We made a terrible mistake," he said. "We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right." The universal lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt transcends aviation history. It is a timeless warning against dogmatic thinking and the arrogance of judging a new idea by old standards. The Luftwaffe tried to fight a fencer's duel, only to discover their opponent had brought a shotgun. The Thunderbolt story proves that true strength often lies where you least expect it, in ruggedness, not elegance, in brute force, not finesse, in the ability to absorb blows, not just deliver them. Today, a handful of these magnificent warbirds sit silently in museums around the world. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force, a restored P-47D stands as a monument to this philosophy. Its placard lists statistics and battle honors, but the true story is found in the words of an unnamed German pilot, taken from an interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The legacy of the P-47 echoes in the design of another famously ugly, brutally effective aircraft built decades later, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog. Like its ancestor, the A-10 was built around a massive gun designed for survivability and created not to win dogfights, but to dominate the battlefield below. It is a direct descendant of the philosophy that Alexander Kartveli pioneered in 1941, that in the brutal calculus of war, the last one standing wins. The P-47 Thunderbolt began its journey as a punchline and ended it as an instrument of total victory. The story of how the flying milk bottle became the thunderclap that silenced the Luftwaffe is a testament to an American way of war. A war won not just by brave pilots, but by the draftsmen, the engineers, the riveters, and the unstoppable power of an industrial giant that, once awakened, remade the world. In 1943, German pilots looked at the Thunderbolt and laughed. By 1945, there was no one left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of history's most misunderstood warplanes. If you found this story as compelling as we do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that goes beyond the headlines of history. What are your thoughts on the P-47's design philosophy? Do you agree that its perceived flaws were its greatest strengths? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay curious.